when you hide something, when you really think like, oh my God, like if these people find out about this thing, I found out that that thing that you're super worried about, that's actually the thing that you need to bring into the world. Like that's what people need you here for.
What's up, guys? Thanks for tuning into the Why Influence podcast, where we interview influencers about their why and motivation for sharing online. I'm your host, Jeremy Siegel. Today, our guest is Mark Metry from the podcast Human 2.0. Mark's primary goal is to help people eliminate their internal enemy so they can live a life of mental and emotional freedom. Mark's podcast is having a real impact and is currently getting tens of thousands of downloads per episode, with some episodes hitting hundreds of thousands of downloads. Without giving any more spoilers, let's jump into the interview.
Welcome to the Why Influence podcast, where we deep dive into the why behind some of the world's most influential people. Why do you influence? Why are you an influencer? We hope to inspire you to share your voice with the world. And now, your host, Jeremy Siegel.
Mark, thanks so much for coming on the show. Before we jump into your why, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your background real quick.
Thanks for having me on the show, Jeremy.
So, I read the profile on your homepage, and it talked about how you struggled with having a voice. So do you mind just talking about how you were prior to starting your podcast and sharing online?
Yeah, sure. So for me, I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, up in the East Coast of the United States. And I came from immigrants from Egypt, my parents, and they came to this country with $200. And growing up, had my fair share of experiences. I had some health issues as a kid that really impacted my energy levels and how much I was really able to express myself. And, on top of that, I also ended up, for most of my adolescent life, growing up in a town very small town, a lot of great people, but also mainly all Caucasian. And so I was basically like one of the few families in my entire town that looked different. And so I definitely had my fair share of bullying and racism and things along those natures. But that really, for me, just created this really I think of it now as sort of like an operating system of where, as I got older, I just conditioned myself to really just put myself in a bubble and just try to get by, put my head down whenever I'd walk into a classroom. My goal would be to sit in the back, don't make direct eye contact with people. And then I'd basically just go home and play video games. And I mean, that was basically my life until, for me, when I was 15, 16 years old, I ended up starting the world's #1 Minecraft server. And that made me a lot of money at a young age, like 6 figures, but it really actually made me more confused because, I didn't really come from much. I grew up on food stamps, like I grew up in parts of the hood and never really had access to money. And so, when I was sort of self-made from really just sort of playing a video game, doing something that I loved, I thought my life would be all set until I realized that I still had the money and I still thought of myself as a loser. I still didn't really have any friends. And so I quickly began to realize that I was completely my brain was just chasing the wrong beliefs, the wrong narratives. And I didn't figure that out until I was 18 years old, where I really became conscious of a lot of this stuff. I went off to college. And at first, when I was first becoming aware of this stuff, it actually made me more depressed because I sort of saw the future as this impending doom of if I don't do something about all my issues right now, I'm just going to end up as one of those 30-year-olds that can't even talk to people, that doesn't even have any friends, that just works some kind of job that he just sort of haphazardly shows up for, goes home, just sleeps from watching TV, just really a horrible life. And I also could see the great side. I could also see the amazing future that I could have because, I had looked back at all my successes and I was like, damn, Mark, you're doing this at this age. And, on top of that, you're a kind person, various things that I guess I like about myself, but I wasn't really taking action. I wasn't actually changing my behavior. And so I had all these thoughts, but I wasn't actually doing anything about it because I didn't know how. And so, to make a long story short, that basically led, when I was 18, to really, experience some pretty serious depression, really, intense social isolation, which eventually led me to flirting with suicide. And after that, that was sort of my rock bottom. And it took me a while to straighten things out, but eventually I did. And man, I mean, it's been a crazy journey so far. So thanks for asking.
Sure. I appreciate you sharing that story with us. As far as when you were looking for actions to take or changes in your behavior to move towards the potential future that you saw as the positive future, what were some of the things that you felt that you needed to take action on, or behaviors that you needed to change in order to achieve this potential good future that you saw for yourself?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, when this was happening, if you asked me that, then I wouldn't even understand what you were saying. And, when I was at like rock bottom, you don't actually know you're at rock bottom per se. And like a friend of mine, Garen Jones, he has this quote, and he says, "You can't see the picture when you're in the frame." And that was very much my issue. So I didn't actually know this stuff was going on at the time, and I didn't have the words to describe it. And, therefore, that's often why people don't actually do anything, because they don't actually know until the sort of cycle consumes them. And now they're basically living their life off a past program that they've created. But for me, what actually began is like, when I was during this time, the way that I coped with it was by binge eating, was by eating a lot. I ate a whole ton of junk food and a ton of crap. And, I was eventually like 220 pounds. Like today, just for reference, I'm 165. So that was like a completely different time in my life where I just gained a ton of weight. And so I realized that after a while. And so, I had this moment where, I just sort of looked at myself in the mirror and I was just like, wait, what's going on? Like, why aren't my pants fitting? Or, why is my shirt now too tight? And I looked at my mirror and I was like, damn, I see some kind of change. And, I believe that now looking back at it, that physical weight was just the manifestation of my problems and my mindset. And so what I began to do is I saw I got fat. Hey, I'm going to research, how do I lose weight? Because at that time, I had never heard of the words mindset, what's your why, self-development. I had never heard of any of this stuff. And so for me, it was just like, okay, how do I lose weight? And so that really set me on this journey of trying to find like an optimal diet, which eventually led me to finding the bulletproof diet, which is a diet that advocates for mental performance, which is basically just like eating vegetables and eating high fat. And so I did that and I felt my brain turn on for the first time. I went into a state of ketosis. I don't know if you know what that is.
Yeah.
And I really just felt my brain turn on for the first time. And I felt like I got access to who I was. And it was only until then I slowly began to, because when you have more energy, which was something that I really lacked my entire life, going back to my original story of, having low energy due to different kinds of medications that I was on. But once I got access to energy, it's like, you start asking yourself, oh, if I have more energy, what could I do? If you wake up in the morning and you have energy and you're not tired, you're going to be a different person. And so when I began to do that, I began to look for more activities to get into. So it started off with the food, which not only made me lose weight, but more importantly, it sort of gave me my brain back for the first time in my life, which led me to seek different activities like going to the gym for the first time, to sleeping well for 8 hours a day or 7.5 hours, to learning how to meditate, which was massive for me, to just getting in the habit of just checking in with myself every day, just in the method of a journal, like writing things down or even saying your thoughts out loud. Those are the big ones for me, but I mean, I could go on and on about the different things that I did, but that was really how I got started.
Okay, awesome. So then what was your entry point when you started to share more of yourself online? Was the podcast the beginning of that, or did you sort of ease in with other means?
Yeah, so I eased in through other means. So at the very end of 2016, when I was like sort of on the groove now, I ended up starting a business called View Dream. And make a long story short, it's a marketing agency. And, I started that for a few reasons. One of them being, I wanted to really start a conquest for myself, something that, I could place myself in a bigger feedback loop and really just, as a way to really push myself and say to myself, like, I'm going to wake up at 6 a.m. I have these habits and things that I need to do. And then I am, hustling, working on the business, trying to make that a reality because I have clients, I have people that are relying on me. And so, the way that started and the way that we began to market that, it was nothing personal, nothing of the sort. It was all really just based around like technology and, just very, impersonal things.
So then when did you start sharing your personal self?
Yeah. So for me, that was when I began to start my podcast, which was towards the end of 2017-ish, like in August. At first I didn't share things personally about myself. For me, I ended up starting the podcast because I just wanted to get direct access from people and learn from them directly. And I wanted to make it mutually beneficial rather than just be one of those people that just messages people and is like, can I have 15 minutes to pick your brain? I was like, I'm going to start this podcast. Hopefully, it gets bigger and, I can have something to offer them rather than, just taking time away from their life. And so that's why I started the podcast. And at first I just began to interview people. And honestly, it wasn't until maybe about like a year. So maybe like June of last year of 2018 is when I got really consistent with just sharing a little bit about myself and my own story and the different things that, I have gone through and what I've learned from them. And it definitely took a while, but it was only until then where I began to share it. And once I did that, things took for like a whole nother level.
Awesome. So the first year of your podcast, you interviewed people for the purpose of trying to have conversations with some high caliber people and extracting information from them. And you really didn't share much of yourself during those interviews. You mostly just asked questions or dug deep into them, not really bringing much value from yourself personally other than to be a good interviewer. Is that correct?
I mean, honestly, I don't think I was a pretty good interviewer, but yeah, that's about right.
All right. And then about a year ago, you started sharing, being more vulnerable for yourself and bringing more of your personality into your podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to say it was actually probably like the beginning of 2018 is where I slowly got the idea. And then by the time like May, June by the time it was then the podcast itself started to pick up. And, I was just getting questions from people asking like just more questions about myself. And, I started talking a bit about myself on the podcast. I also began to like post videos on like social media, like on LinkedIn of just my life and stuff. And yeah, and once that happened, it really took everything to a different level.
Nice. So thinking back to when you first started your podcast, that must have been a big jump for you to put yourself out there like that. So do you mind going into a little bit about what was going through your mind when you were creating those early, like first couple of podcasts and how you felt in those moments?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely awkward for sure. But this time in my life, I was doing a lot. Like, so, I had mentioned introverted, a lot of social anxiety while sort of I was going through my journey of, like I was telling you, of like eating healthy and doing all these different things. I really, really made it a point to really just defeat my social anxiety. And so what I would do is I would literally, some people can call it exposure therapy today. But what I would do is I would, since I knew I was terrified of people, terrified of talking, I would pull out a piece of paper and I'd write down, okay, Mark, today you're going to walk outside today randomly on the streets of Boston, and you're going to ask 10 random people what the time is. And then once I did that, I would go out and I'd ask 10 random people what the time is, and then maybe directions to get somewhere. And then I would ask them what the time is, directions, and then I would try to leave them a compliment. And so I eventually worked my stages up and up and up to the point where combining that with my increased energy and exercising and letting go of like negative energy, obviously you can't get rid of something 100%, but my social anxiety at that point was largely gone. And so because I had done that work, when it came to the podcast, obviously for sure, I was intimidated. And obviously for sure, I was not great at my first 10 podcasts. It was really interesting. But eventually, I just got to this point, and honestly, I'm still there, where you just sort of look at something and you're like, if people know this about me, and I'm afraid of that, then that's actually a problem, unless it's like your bank account or something, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
And so it really just became this Band-Aid of just like, I don't feel like posting this, or, my brain is telling me, oh, Mark, what if people find out about this or this? And then I just remind myself that everything in life is basically in the mind. And if you can understand that, then you can post as many podcasts as you can. And, what I really began to understand about life is that I share stuff all the time. So like literally yesterday, I posted on LinkedIn. I was like, when was the last time you cried? The last time I cried was a few days ago. And I'm trying to do that because I'm not only trying to be authentic and just trying to share real stuff on social media other versus everybody else's highlight reel that's fake, but I'm also trying to really just discover myself. And what I realized about all of this is that when you hide something, when you really think like, oh my God, like if these people find out about this thing, I found out that that thing that you're super worried about, that's actually the thing that you need to bring into the world. Like that's what people need you here for. And on top of that, when you hide stuff, it builds a certain level of shame and guilt. And that's actually the thing that causes the problems, not the actual problem. So for me, having social anxiety was not actually the problem. But for me, the problem was thinking that I had a problem because I was socially anxious. And I didn't realize most people have that just to varying degrees. And we all have certain work to do. And so, yeah, it was a super interesting time in my life. And honestly, like I would probably say like I've understood this maybe just like within the last 6 months of like me as my career has picked up. Like I've speak across the world. I've had some pretty cool like scenarios. Like I've had some people, not like all the time, but some people like stop me in the street because they recognize me from either my LinkedIn or my podcast. And it's so fascinating because oftentimes if they do, they'll say like, oh, Mark, oh yeah. And that's because, when you were in 3rd grade, this happened. Or when you were in 6th grade, you got beat up here or whatever that is. And it's just like, I've shared so much now that I've like just completely exposed my life to the point where if somebody tells me something like in real life, there's like a part of my brain that's like, wait, how did you know that? But then I remember that I actually talked about it on a podcast or, I mentioned it on social media. And doing that is super, super liberating because when you don't really have any places to hide, it gives you like the ultimate freedom and you don't really have that much fear, compared to other people that are still operating under that previous version 1.0 lifestyle reality way of thinking, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, you shared a ton of different things just now. I mean, I liked how you talked about the exposure therapy and that you would just talk to 10 people, ask for time, then talk to 10 people asking time and directions, then doing that with a compliment. I think a lot of people use different methods to build up their confidence in communicating to start something. And I think that's a unique scenario that I haven't heard yet from anybody else. Like for me, I used Toastmasters. I went to that for about 1.5 to 2 years and just practiced talking in front of a small group. And that was my way of just articulating and practice speaking and standing in front of people. And I think everyone takes their own path for that.
Yeah, definitely, man. I mean, for me, the physiological side was massive. And, what I actually understood is that, I mean, it definitely depends, but anxiety could actually be a side effect of your body not getting what it wants or getting the wrong kinds of things. So, I mean, that's why I stressed out like on the food. And I'm sure you've heard of serotonin.
Yeah.
The chemical in our brain that, a lot of people say basically like regulates your mood, decides, if you're happy or not, similar stuff like that. I was reading this and I think the most recent scientific estimates say that most of our serotonin, 90% of our serotonin receptors are not actually in our brain. They're actually in our gut microbiome, which is like which is a super complicated ecosystem of bacteria, of trillions of bacteria and funguses and viruses in our body that a lot of science is now saying there's a massive connection between that and somebody's overall mental health. And so for me, once I started eating better, like I felt like I was now able to take control because, if you were talking to like the super young version of me and you tried to have this conversation, I definitely would probably not have understood it. And on top of that, I probably would have put in like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't have a choice. I don't actually have control over this. And it wasn't until I intervened with the physiological health side that I was able to then gain some control to then do, I did some public speaking too and that exposure therapy. So it's all steps. But I think like if you focus on what a human just naturally has evolved to do, I think that's pretty universal for everybody.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So it sounds like you had a ton of motivation to drive you through this, pushing you to self-develop yourself, to get more comfortable talking to people so that then you can start a podcast so that you can talk to smart people. So like when you started your podcast, you talked about the reason was to have these conversations with people who maybe you couldn't otherwise have these conversations with. But before we move on from that, is there anything else that comes to mind as to your reasons for starting on top of that, or maybe deeper into it?
Yeah, man. I mean, I think it was a lot of things. I think one of them was just like I had lived my life in this certain way, and I knew how goddamn horrible it was. And I basically got to a point of being sick and tired of being sick and tired, and really just realizing, like, if this goes on, like, I think I'm actually going to kill myself. And I mean, I got close.
Okay. So like you knew the downside of if you didn't self-improve, and then you also had the desire to have these conversations with other people. So the combination of those two.
Yeah, I mean, and then on top of that, it wasn't just obviously just to have just like conversations with people. It was just, really just looking at my life and just knowing that I could really, really do way, way, way more. And so it was also like me feeling like I'm wasting my life, me feeling like I have all of this raw potential that I have seen come out previously in my life in some ways, but I haven't even targeted it. And imagine if I did, what would happen? So it's kind of both of those sides.
That makes sense. So as far as the raw potential goes, then when you started or before starting, you saw this raw potential in yourself. What was your like target for that when you were starting your podcast?
For me, like when I had started this journey, the podcast was really not like a part of the plan. It was like the podcast is honestly just something that I just ended up randomly starting. And it was just one of those things that really took off. But I think for me is, I mean, I honestly just want to change the world. And I know I'm a long way to get there. And, my ultimate moonshot is to help 1 billion people around the world by providing them with the right mental and emotional tools they need to, really just self-heal in their life. And so that was my mission because, I think you need a larger than life mission. I think you need something bigger than yourself. But I think you also need to be motivated by, all the work that you have to do on yourself, with also that understanding, like that patient understanding of like, I'm 22 years old right now. I have a long way to go. I've got to sort of focus on the right values and the right moves right now, while steady climbing, and I'm aiming for the top. And so
I like that.
Yeah, that was really, really it. And as the podcast started and as I began to talk to people, my ideas have changed, so many different times, but all along the same thread of really this, because, at the end of the day, man, like, I always just envision like the 12 or 13-year-old version of myself and, what I was doing and thinking at that time. And it can be better. And I know we can give people the tools. Like I know for me growing up, I had literally never understood or heard of the word mental health or anxiety or depression, or whenever I heard those words, I would just disassociate from them. And so, yeah, I mean, that's really it, man. Like a lot of human psychology, a lot of self-development, really into that stuff and trying to expand that around the world.
I love that. So then your purpose, is driven by the fact that that's stuff that you wish you had access to growing up. You wish that you could have listened to your podcast or had like an outlet that gave you that kind of information. And that's one driving factor for this.
Yeah, for sure. And also, I'd say another driving factor is I think the future of this world is going to be pretty amazing. And, I want to be a part of it. And I think what's going around the world today, just like any other time in human history, I think we're in a very, very important moment just all around the world with, all the different kinds of revolutions and protests that we're having to lead to an evolution of human consciousness. And I mean, I just want to be a part of that. And I remember when I was sitting in history class when I was a kid and, we were learning about some kind of war or revolution that was happening. I mean, I would always think to myself, like, I wonder what I would do in those moments. Like, which side would I be on? Like, I mean, could I really choose, or can I be a part of history? And so that's definitely a part of it, because I know, especially in this time, everything is being recorded, everything is being documented, and we're really getting close to the truth. And I just want to be a part of that.
I love that. That's awesome. So I like the comment about being a part of history and how everything's recorded and documented, and how all of that collectively just brings everything closer to the truth. That's a lot of aligned with my purpose for the podcast.
Yeah, man, it's a really crazy time to be alive. I'm super grateful. And it's just like, I mean, I remember when nobody even thought that the internet, or even though I'm a young guy, that this was even going to be anything of relevance. And so, I mean, it's just crazy to see the evolution of it. over the years, and I'm just glad to be a part of it, as you.
Yeah, I agree. So thinking about who you were before starting the podcast, you spent some energy interacting with people in the street, building up the confidence to start the podcast and then having these conversations. So right around when you started the podcast to where you are today, I guess a little bit more than 2 years later, how do you feel like the podcast has changed you?
Yeah, so personally speaking, it's been a great tool for expression. It's been a great tool of really just like curiosity and discovery, as we noted before. Professionally speaking, it's completely changed the game for me. The podcast is really like the main thing that I'm known for, but I also run a business. And so, I've probably basically gotten, I think, all my clients from people knowing who I am from the podcast and then seeing that I have a business and then hiring me. And on top of that, it's just led the door for just insane amount of collaborations and partnerships. And, people that I used to really look up to are now like my friends that I text. And on top of that, like in terms of speaking, the podcast is all responsible for my speaking career. I literally got started in speaking last year. It was my first time ever. And I've done like something like just over 50. And it's been so crazy. And like next few months, I'm going on like a United States like mini tour across the 5 biggest cities in America and just like going all over the place, Europe to Asia. All of that is from really this thing that I have built that I don't even feel like is even my thing. I feel like it's just sort of this movement that I started and now it's just got a thing of its own. But yeah, I think the podcast for me professionally is everything. I could go more into it if you have any specifics, but it's completely changed my life.
Oh, yeah. That was exactly what I'm looking for. Just, anything that comes to mind for how it's changed you. And then as far as leading up to your speaking career, you think that podcasting hundreds of episodes has helped you be more comfortable on stage?
Maybe. This is what I think. I think podcasting has enabled me to get more comfortable at talking and expressing my thoughts. I definitely think it's made me a little bit better of a speaker just with my language and the way that I can communicate. But I think speaking like quote unquote in real life is like a whole other thing on its own. And it's really just a combination of a ton of elements and it's going to be interesting. So for me, like I try to speak everywhere I can because it's always just a good challenge, right? It always makes me a little bit nervous, but then I not always crush it. And people come up to me after and are like crying. I've literally had like the most crazy experience. And who knows, like this month, like in a couple weeks, I'm going to be going down to this event called LinkedIn Global, and I'm going to be speaking, and there's going to be a few thousand people there. So that'll be the biggest audience I have ever spoken in front of. So, it's always an interesting ride. And honestly, I think that people would not know who I am if I didn't have this podcast. And on top of that, the podcast is so great because it builds credibility for like really who you could be and really for who you want to be. And what I mean by that is like, you can start a podcast, you could start a whatever, and you can come into this world with, your ideas about X, Y, and Z. But the matter of fact is, if you don't have any credibility, if you don't have people backing you up, it really doesn't mean anything. And so for me, the way that I became credible and people began to, whether it was hire me or invite me to speak, was me showing up consistently and building trust, but also having other people almost vouch for me in the sense of either like not necessarily a direct testimonial, but just people seeing that I collaborated with them. And so that is a massive part to like just the whole sort of podcast engine, I guess that you'd want to say. And I think that's probably like the biggest part about it. That's like the most important thing to know, professionally speaking.
Yeah, that's huge. And I couldn't agree with you more. Actually, did my first public speaking thing on stage, podcast movement in Orlando. And
nice.
There's about 300 to 400 people there. And so when I got off the stage, my hands were shaking and stuff. But afterwards, someone approached me and said that, because I was up there, she has felt inspired to speak next year, and she's really uncomfortable with challenging herself with that. So it was pretty awesome, getting that feedback.
Yeah.
So speaking of...
Good for you, bro.
Thanks. Yeah, you talked about how some people have approached you after you spoke in person, maybe crying or...
Yeah.
So do you have like a memorable story of someone you influenced? Okay, that came fast.
Yeah, I mean, it literally happened last month. So I was also in Orlando and I was speaking at an event, a few hundred people there. And I basically just told my life story. And I, told my life story and I said the things that I did to get out of there and really just reinvent myself as a human and just telling my story. And there was a mom in the crowd with her husband and her son. And after I had finished my talk, I went to the bathroom. I came out and she was just there. She was smiling. She said, hi, do you have a minute to speak? And the moment she started talking, she just started crying. And it was because her son literally almost had an identical story with mine. Bullied, had zero friends, went off to video games, to retreat. And she was telling me when I was talking, he literally was making not direct eye contact, but he literally did not look at his phone once. He was staring at me very intensely the whole time. And later she emailed me like pretty recently and she told me that like her sons just started doing completely different things. And I mean, that's just one example of just so many different things that I've just completely unfortunately lost track of, but like, honestly, like it's such a blessing. And, really what I'm understanding now is like this podcast that I've built is almost like it's like a hurricane. And we mentioned Orlando. I hope everyone there is safe, but
Yeah, it curved.
yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah, it's going up north now.
Okay. Maybe that's why I'm going to get thunderstorms up here in Boston later. All right. Wish me luck. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
But yeah, so what I was saying is the podcast is really like a hurricane. And what I mean by that is like you're throwing out there in the world where every time you put out an episode, every time you put out something on social media, you're putting out just magnets into the world and it attracts people. And eventually you do so much of that. Like I'm sitting on hundreds and hundreds of episodes that I've done with interviews, let alone the hundreds that I've done by myself, with the thousands of social media posts and the countless times I've been interviewed on podcasts like these, to people listening to my podcast and then telling a friend about it, to people inviting me to speak, to people inviting me to go on tour with them. It literally just creates like this storm. And like these things that I just mentioned in that story, they're happening so frequently. They're happening so often that it's literally blowing my mind every single second. Like I feel like I'm in a very vivid just hallucination of my life, very lightly, but really, man, it's truly, truly tremendous and it drives me forward. But also at the same time, things are changing and I've always got to stay humble and, make sure to not get ahead of myself and to really feel these moments, to really feel how powerful and how important they are. Because, a lot of people get to the stage and, they put up this, the magic begins to lose its appeal and they put up like this plexiglass of emotions and people can come up to you, whether it's, they're crying or telling you these crazy stories or how you impact their life. And you could just say, oh yeah, that's cool. And there's a balance right there. You've got to be really, really important about that, because if you do that, eventually you're going to end up going back to like who you literally were, version 1.0, as I refer to it, and you lost touch with version 2.0. And so it's been a crazy journey, man. And I know it's just the first of, really what's to come. And, a lot of great reminders in my life that I got to remind myself with, especially as, things in life are changing pretty fast.
Yeah, that's huge. And I like the picture that you paint with talking about the hurricane and how you've got hundreds of interviews, both through guests and through yourself. You've got thousands of posts. You're getting invited on podcasts such as this. Your speaking is just constant movement and it's all feeding your movement. So it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
So all of these stories that you hear from your guests and the hurricane just constantly driving forward with this purpose, it takes a lot of work to do all that. Do you mind sharing a time when you struggled with motivation since starting your podcast? Like, is there an example that comes to mind when you struggled with motivation?
Yeah, man. I mean, honestly, like all the time. And so, one thing that really changed how I think about this very question and idea is when I got to talk to, I don't know if you ever heard of him, Jeff Hayden. He's one of the editors at Inc. magazine. And he wrote this book called Motivation is a Myth. And basically what he says is, in his book, he went on this journey and he talked to like wicked successful people like Serena Williams, like professional athletes, like really people who are stepping up their performance all day, every day. And she was telling him, like, when I was at practice, when I was starting this business, I never got like a thunderbolt of motivation. It was always this process of me just taking one step, even if I was feeling unmotivated. And that action in and of itself is the momentum that created the motivation. And so honestly, all the time, I sometimes feel I'm unmotivated, but it's always that reminder of just understanding how motivation and the human mind actually works. And again, the reminder that life, everything is in the mind. Motivation is not like a fixed entity. You don't have like a fixed amount of motivation during the day or whatever that is. You could literally be motivated on whatever you want it to be, as long as you're able to control my mind. And, for me, I know that just, again, physiologically speaking, I'm not going to be super motivated if I'm sleep deprived. I'm not going to be super motivated if I'm either hungry or I've eaten some trashy food. I know I'm not going to be super, super motivated if I haven't used my physical body for some kind of movement. I know I'm not going to be super motivated if I'm doing something that I hate to do. And so those are sort of my guidelines. And in the micro moments where I don't feel motivated to, let's say in the gym, like basically every morning when I wake up, there's some part of my brain that's trying to tell me to not wake up and go to the gym. But, I've just been ingrained in this process, and I've spoken to enough people to just understand that that is just BS for my brain, because my brain is just an organ, just like the heart. And the brain thinks in the same way that the heart beats. It's involuntary. You cannot stop it. And so if you understand that, then you really just understand that your brain can be, your greatest ally, and it can also be your worst nightmare. And honestly, man, like I have had conversations with the world's most successful people. I'm talking billionaires, I'm talking professional athletes, Olympians, and they literally all go through this. And it's just that understanding. And if you get that and you take care of like the right prerequisites on your physiological side, and you make sure that, what you're doing is something that, like, just on a why purpose level, you want to be spending your life, your very limited life here on planet Earth, doing that and not just wasting it, doing something else that you'd rather not do. If you can keep that in mind, I think you will be able to work through the moments where you feel like you don't have motivation.
That's awesome. A ton of value there. And I think that's a great way to look at it.
Definitely, man. That's the key.
Yeah. So we don't have a ton of time. There's a couple more things I'd like to ask. So I'm going to try to get a few things going here. One is, do you mind diving into a little bit about your podcast performance, just so our audience can learn a little bit more about it? Like, when you first started out, what kind of numbers you were seeing as far as downloads to like type of stuff that you're seeing today, if you're open with all that?
Yeah. And a great quote that I saw is, numbers don't have any meaning without context. And so, with that being said, when I first started my podcast, like I had said, I started it in August of 2017. Definitely took me a while to start it because I had procrastinated for a while, but I finally did it. And when I did it, I did it sort of very haphazardly. I would post like one episode like every other week, and then all of a sudden I post 2 episodes in 2 days. And so it was very sporadic. It was all over the place. It was basically like that from August of 2017 to the end of 2017. And, I remember I had this moment at the very beginning of 2018. It was actually on New Year's. And I really just sort of looked at the podcast and what I was doing. And, I don't know, I just got like a spidey sense in sort of the way of like, I have a feeling this could be something. Even though at that time, nobody was listening to my podcast. I think my downloads are like 25 downloads, something like that, or 50 downloads per episode. And so nobody was listening to my podcast. And yet, I just made this decision to really just triple down. And the reason why I did that, Jeremy, was because I looked around at all the podcasts that were sort of in my area. And I realized that other than like the handful of people that are crushing it, like the handful of people that have top podcasts, there's almost nobody taking this seriously. And I remember even back in 2017, I still thought that the podcast market was super oversaturated and taken up. And some people that I talked to start podcasts said, dude, there's so many podcasts out there. There's no way you can do it. And so I basically just sort of saw this as an advantage. And if you look at, I guess, podcast history, if you know John Lee Dumas, host of EO Fire,
yeah,
great guy. I don't know if you've had him on the show.
No, but I got him to commit to challenging me to a goal that if I hit, he'll come on the show.
Dude, that's awesome. So I had him on my show, and his story is that he was listening to podcasts, and then he ended up starting his own podcast. And the way that he really did it was he began to do it every day. And so I didn't know about him at the time, but that's basically what I did. And as I began to do more episodes and release more, I began to interview more people. And as I began to do that, you just get more feedback, you get more data. And then you start to implement, you start to learn, okay, if I do this differently, then this thing works better. Or if I share this on social media in this way, then it works better. And so honestly, up until like February, 2 months after I was into this sort of like mission in 2018, then that's where I started to develop a bit of an audience. Like I remember I'd get like 700 downloads an episode, and then I'd get like 800, then I get 900. And then, really honestly, man, for me, like I ended up making the decision to do the podcast every day in like June of 2018. And when I did that, that's where things really, really began to pick up. That's when like my podcast hit like the Apple Top 100 list next to like Gary Vee and Tim Ferriss and Jordan Harbinger and NPR and all these people. That's where I began to book like the biggest amount of guests. Yeah, I mean, I've had podcast episodes that are sitting at like 500,000 downloads. I have some episodes that are at like 12,000 downloads. And so it definitely ranges, but it's massive. And honestly, to be honest, it really, sometimes it sort of scares me. Like when I think this thing that I'm about to upload is about to be heard sometime within like this week by tens of thousands of people, honestly, sometimes it intimidates me a little bit. But it's going back to, a question you asked me and my answer for it. It's just that Band-Aid. It's just understanding that your brain is just telling you this because, we've evolved as, psychosocial creatures to really look at people's opinions and our perception of other people's opinions, even if they're not real, as really just obstacles in the environment. And so it's just always that constant reminder, man. And then at the same time, like I know podcast hosts, friends of mine that are, really interested in upping their downloads, but what they're doing is they wake up every morning and the first thing they do is when they're sitting on the toilet is checking their podcast downloads and their statistics. And it's just like, honestly, I didn't even look at my statistics for other than like the first few months, like the first 8 months, because I just knew I had to execute. If my brain thought like, oh, wow, if I keep doing this and nobody's listening to it, I might stop. I knew that was a risk and I didn't want to do that. And so, podcast downloads is definitely obviously on like from a marketing performance standpoint, it's super, super important, of course. Like I look at my downloads maybe like on a bi-weekly, monthly basis, or when other business things come up that are relevant towards that, I need that information. But honestly, like I don't really, I put too much attachment on my podcast downloads. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. It's overall growing, which is fantastic. But, I think the matter of the fact is, and honestly, I have had more beneficial things happen in my life and opportunities come up, not from actually like getting a ton of downloads, but from maybe even having a guest that I've had on my show who I've built a relationship with, that I'm friends with, that has helped me move my career somehow. That's probably like the biggest thing that I have seen about it for sure.
Nice. Well, thanks so much for being vulnerable and sharing that. I mean, it was awesome hearing your entire journey from when you started to where you are today. I think that's a lot of value and insight into the numbers game. And obviously we've had several guests come on the show talking about how you should not be focusing on that, but it's just good to hear like the breakout of, you're posting haphazardly to becoming more consistent and seeing the results and becoming daily and seeing the results. And I think that's the bigger picture that matters more.
Yeah, and absolutely, man. And at the end of the day, it's just like anybody can do it. It's just a matter of putting in enough sacrifices to see if you actually want to make it happen. Because like I said, it's such a rewarding thing for sure, but it's also not for everybody. And so there's definitely another degree of self-awareness that can come into there. And I appreciate the compliment.
Sure. If somebody was looking to build influence and they aren't currently doing anything, or maybe just started their influence, maybe let's talk about podcasting because that's what you've got a lot of experience with. What would be the biggest advice you would give this person starting out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be don't just try to be an influencer. Don't just try to talk, even if you don't have anything to say. I think the matter of the fact is, everyone's at different stages of their life, and not everybody is in a stage to, or is even comfortable doing that. But if you think you are, what I would say is find a medium, whether that's podcasting or making music or drawing art or writing, and stick with it and use that as a form for yourself to really express yourself. Put it up online and, see what kind of people you attract, see what kind of individuals that, you really want to be around. And as that grows, you might start a blog series, you might end up starting a podcast, but it's really very much like a step-by-step process that is not exactly straight shot, that really everyone has a bit of a tweak into. So it definitely depends, but find a medium and just stick with it and adapt.
Awesome. Well, I'd like to end the episode by giving you opportunity to talk about your brand, your social accounts, your podcasts, anything else that you'd like to share with our audience, as well as any last words that you think would be helpful for them.
Yeah. So, I mean, if self-improvement, that stuff is up your alley, check out my podcast, and any of my website, social media, you can just Google my name. It's Mark Metry, MarkMetry. And Jeremy, I appreciate you, my friend, for having me on the show. More importantly, maybe not more importantly, but I really appreciate everybody getting to the end of this podcast. I mean, we know how valuable people's time is, and the fact that you made it this far, that just says something about yourself. So definitely give yourself a pat on the back for that. And I hope to hear from you. I'm very open on social media. Feel free to connect with me. Feel free to send me a message. I'd love to hear from you. And please mention that you came from this episode from Jeremy.
Awesome. Well, Mark, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your journey. I hope you have a great remainder of 2019, and I look forward to seeing your influence keep on growing.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate you.
Well, that concludes the episode. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen in today and listen to the episode in its entirety. Mark, thanks again for coming on the podcast and being vulnerable with us and sharing your why. One of my favorite nuggets that Mark shared with us today is when he talked about how the podcast feels like a hurricane. He's putting all this effort and energy into his podcast, creating all this content, doing all these posts. He's getting these speaking events, and everything's just sort of feeding each other, bringing more people into his community, more people into his as listeners. And he's just building this hurricane that's becoming unstoppable. And I thought that was a really good analogy, and I thought that was really interesting. I think it's pretty crazy how fast Mark has built a platform. In 2 years, he's done over 300 episodes. In the past year, he's gotten over 50 public speaking events when he never really did public speaking before. He's about to speak at his largest live audience in the thousands. I really like how Mark shared his whole journey from a high level, just saying in the beginning he was intermittently posting episodes every once in a while, and he got up to about 25 to 50 downloads per episode. And then he decided to take it more seriously, be more consistent, do more content. And then he did another wave of doing it more consistently with more content and more seriously. And that's what sort of brought him to where he is now. And 2 years in, he's built this platform that can then drive him forward into the future. And it's just opening doors for him left and right. It's still just the beginning. I mean, he's only 2 years in. Imagine if when he's 10 years in, the kind of doors that will open and the position he's going to be in. So it's just proof that doing a podcast can open doors, and he doesn't really know what kind of doors it'll open. I don't think anybody would or should, but it's just amazing the amount of doors that have opened already for him for taking this seriously and doing it for 2 years. I also liked part of Mark's why when he mentioned that he wants to be part of history. Everything he's doing is recorded, it's documented, and it's helping just human race get closer to the truth, whatever truth it is that the human race will eventually get to. He's just escalating the speed at which we get there. And I think that's aligned a lot with the reason for this podcast, which is helping people get inspired and feel capable to start sharing so that we can get more knowledge and wisdom out there to help lift the consciousness level of the human race. And that's pretty similar to what he's doing, just from a different angle. And I just really vibed with that. A big piece of advice that Mark shared is that you should not start your influence with the purpose of becoming an influencer. That should not be your why going into it. So you need to find your deep level why, and then have that be your driving force that then eventually you could turn into an influencer from. But if your why is to be an influencer, then he strongly suggests to reevaluate how you're going to approach that. He also shared that it's really important to just execute. He didn't really look at stats. He thought that looking at stats could actually slow him down and make him potentially want to stop because he's not getting the results that he wanted. So it's better just to focus on execute. If you create more content, put more content out there, and instead of spending the time looking at stats and looking how things are going, use that energy to put another piece of content out there. And that just over time is going to exponentially bring you further along in the journey. And instead of looking at your stats and dreading and then seeing it's not getting to where it should be, you could be using that energy to create more content that will then make your stats look better. It's just that you're not looking at it. So just keep executing, keep working at it, and eventually something will come from it. I thought I did a really good job of this interview, and I asked Mark afterwards, if he had any feedback or what his thoughts were, and he liked that I didn't just ask a series of questions and go from question to question. He said that I could have made the podcast a little more personal, bringing more of my story and my side of things into the conversation. That's something I'm working on, so I'm glad that he reaffirmed that for me. I think my main struggle with that for this episode was that Mark was just sharing so much value that I just wanted to extract more for you to listen to. And I didn't feel like contributing my side of the story, because if I did that, I'm taking away time that we're extracting from Mark. But I didn't need to remember that you're here to hear my journey as well as being like someone new to the influence space and someone who's new to sharing and putting themselves out there. So I'm trying to incorporate more myself, and I'm going to be working on that in future episodes. Something else I think I could work on is being able to better interject myself. I think I interjected maybe once in this episode when Mark was talking, but if that's something that I can get better at, I can sort of have a little more control over the conversation or maybe guide it in a certain path or way. Usually in this conversation, I was waiting for Mark to finish his thought and finish what he was saying before moving on to the next point. I think if I built more confidence in interjecting, then I can make the episode a little more engaging. Now, how did I find Mark? How did Mark come to being a guest on the show? Well, I went to the Podcast Movement Conference and I met Zach at Himalaya, and he vibed a lot with my mission, and he said, hey, I know someone who's actually a good fit to be a guest on your show. So he suggested Mark, made the introduction. I told Mark about my podcast. He said he would come on it, and then we just scheduled it and he came on. This is just another example of how the podcast has opened doors for me, because one, I would not have been at that conference if I didn't have a podcast. Two, I would not have talked to Zach at Himalaya and had a conversation with him about my podcast if I didn't have a podcast. And then three, I would never have been introduced to Mark from Zach, even if I met him on the street, if I didn't have my podcast to bring him up in the conversation and make an introduction for. So just having the podcast has opened doors for me to now have a conversation and potentially a relationship with Mark, who's doing huge things in a space that is very similar to the space that I'm trying to get into. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about Mark and his podcast, go to whyinfluence.com, whyinfluence.com, and navigate to episode 19. That's Mark Metry's episode 19. And you'll find show notes in there. You'll find links to all Mark's social medias, his podcast, and a few other goodies. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to share it with a friend or family member. Sharing is the best way to help our mission and help us grow. If you want to get involved with the discussion, head over to whydiscord.com, WHY Discord, DISCORD.com. And I'd love to hear how this episode might have inspired you. And I'd love to just have a conversation with you. Right now, there's only 2 people in the Why Influence community. So if you join, you're definitely going to be memorable to me because there's only 2 people in there right now. So just head over to whydiscord.com and it's going to forward you over to our Discord community. So it's whydiscord, WHYDISCORD.com. And I look forward to seeing you over there. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks for tuning in.